I thought after part 1 that somehow this joint would be easy, but there were some new challenges that made executing this joint much more than a walk in the park. To getting started with Stepped Gooseneck Splice, here are some basic proportions to the illustration to make things easier for you. The proportion system makes things quite simple, and the only thing that really gave me pause was that of the angled slope of the gooseneck, hammerhead part. You can pause it to see more clearly. The slope is determined using the standardized width of the Koshikage, the Japanese carpenter's square, but not actually having one. I first had to do some research. Then had to do a bunch of fiddling using my ruler, drawing and measuring, never a good thing. I cut my version of this stepped gooseneck splice using an old chunk of 4x4 that I had rescued from the dump. My time in was 3.5 hours, one shot, no trial fitting, and I made the thing too darn tight. This is never coming apart, not necessarily a good thing or too tight. The bulk of the time was in excavating the recessed areas and making the interfaces as flush, plumb, and true as possible. The finished joint looks cool, is decently strong, and was very fun to cut. I square the stock, plane things smooth, so that I can better see my layout, then start drawing. This timber is large enough to use a proper centerline layout method, something that is really growing on me. With any stock that is less than perfectly square and of uneven thickness, centerline is my new way. Slow learner, I guess. I grab a marking gauge, set it to something close to half the timber width, then make a mark. I strike a second mark from the opposite face. In this example, my gauge was set too close to the halfway, so my two marks kind of smooshed together, but the result is close enough to the true center. Now I can strike a line the length of the joint, to use as my origination point for laying out the joint. I started out squaring off lines using a regular carpenter's framing square, but the huge, awful thing was way more trouble than help. A machinist's tri-square was of greater assistance. I laid out both halves of the joint on the same piece of wood, just separated by a 1/4 inch waste portion. I wish I got a Koshikage. On the positive side, for this joint I inked the lines using a 0.2mm pen and it worked wonderfully. Not as cool as using the bamboo pen, but far better than the mechanical pencil that I have always used in the past. I never would have thought that I would be cutting to an accuracy of fractions of a millimeter, but here we are. Layout 1 hour, half that being wasted by researching Koshikage and my slower layout, on account of its lack. I cut every perpendicular line possible, while the stock was still full length. Easier to hold onto that way. Sawing all of the cross cuts while the timber is still whole, as opposed to ripping some of the waste first, means that I do nearly twice as much sawing this way. I use my plain Jane Z saw 265 Catawba, nothing fancy. A decent construct grade saw. I'm finding that if I don't use any clamps to hold the piece being sawed, if I rely on gravity, a screw stop on my bench and just hold the material with my offhand, it forces me to saw in a very neutral and controlled manner. More accurate cuts are the result, as well as longer saw life, I suspect. After the two pieces are separated, I rip the other lines, trying to maintain accuracy. I am trying to only saw to half the thickness of the line, leaving nothing to pare or finish. The cheeks of the mortise are cut using the same saw, but a rip tooth would have been much faster here. I wrap a piece of tape on my auger bit to set the depth, then bore out the ends of the mortise to make the excavating easier. My favorite beater chisel, doing its thing. I need to fix another stop block to my bench for this sort of thing, it being hard duty for any clamp. It feels like 1/2 the force is absorbed by the movement of the workpiece. This side wall of the mortise is tolerably square, but this side has too much undercut for my liking. Sloppy work. And another little error shows its head. I mismeasured the gooseneck, hammerhead part. The mortise is correct, but the shoulder of the male portion is 5mm off. Easily rectified. Given a second chance, I cut this line to a very slight taper which will help draw the joint tighter. It is very tight, so there will be no second chance for this guy. A few gaps, but not horrible. Plain smooth. The underside of the joint shows the worst. The tongue is just a hair fat of the line. So, a great practice joint and fun to cut too. By deciding to do as much cutting as I could, right from the get-go, I had more sawing to do, but less drawing and extending of lines. Possibly that helped my accuracy, I'm not sure. Sawing is fun, so I'm happy with that decision. Finally, I cut this joint too tight. With my current level of skill, it would be better had I allowed for at least one trial fitting. I got lucky, thought the fit isn't quite as perfect as I would like.